Hi, and welcome to Modern Servant Leader. Today we have a real treat for you. I'm here with Larry Spears, who's really one of the godfathers of servant leadership, if you will. Larry has written a ton of books, knows a great deal about Greenleaf's views on servant leadership. In fact, he was the CEO and president of Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership for almost 2 decades, and now runs the Spears Center for Servant Leadership. In fact, Larry, you just recently received an award from the Greenleaf Center in the UK for all your contributions to servant leadership over the years, right?
Yes, I did.
Great. And Larry, what I'd like to do before we dive into the questions that I know everybody's wondering about from your take on servant leadership is that I'd like to just kind of get a feel of who Larry is. You know, they'd like to know a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? So tell us a little bit about who Larry is and where you came from.
Okay. I was born in a small town in southwestern Virginia called Pennington Gap, Virginia. And my parents couldn't find work. My father couldn't find work there. The coal mines had sort of run out. So they moved to Detroit when I was about 6 months old. And so I grew up in Detroit until I was 12, on the southwest side of Detroit. And then my family moved to Indianapolis in 1967. And so I went to a junior high, high school, and college in Indiana. Went to DePaul University in Greencastle. As a junior at DePaul, I spent a year off campus in Philadelphia on an experiential learning program called the Great Lakes College Association's Philadelphia Urban Semester. And so I had an internship as part of that work with the American Friends Service Committee, and that was my introduction to Quakers,
Okay.
and ultimately to Robert Greenleaf, who was also a Quaker. After graduation, my wife and I moved out to Philadelphia, and we lived there for about 13 or 14 years, and then moved back to Indianapolis in 1990 to head up to Greenleaf Center.
Wonderful. So Larry, you mentioned your introduction to the Quakers and Robert Greenleaf. Is that when you first heard of the term servant leadership?
Yes, it was 1981. I was on the staff of Friends Journal, a Quaker magazine in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And articles for the journal came by way of contributing authors.
Okay.
And so in the mail one day, we received an essay, which was actually a chapter from Teacher's Servant by Robert Greenleaf. And that was the first time I ever heard the term servant leader. And I remember to this day what an impact it had on me to see and hear this term, because for me, and I've heard this said by many people over the last 25 years that I've been involved with servant leadership, but for me it gave a name and a language to something that I'd felt sort of intuitively within myself as who I wanted to sort of become. But I'd always felt this lack of clarity in terms of what to call it. I think when you have this feeling of wanting to serve others, you often can feel kind of lonely too. And so I think one of the great things that Robert Greenleaf did in coining the term servant leader was giving us some language and ideas where people who share similar ideas
Yes.
could find one another.
Yes.
And I think that's what has happened in no small measure, that people are increasingly finding one another through servant leadership and through the many organizations and associations that are working with servant leadership today.
Wow. I love the way you frame that. And it's amazing to me to think of the lineage and all the things that have happened since that day. What would have happened if Robert Greenleaf hadn't sent that letter to the Quaker, to the journal that you were working on? I mean, because ultimately that led to your role as leading this Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership down the road, right?
Well, it did. It had a role in that 9 years later.
Yeah.
My wife and I, we were actually discovered we were expecting our second child, and it got us to thinking about family issues of being so far away from grandparents and our children, not seeing one another very often. And I felt very uncomfortable about that. I'd had a very close relationship with my grandparents growing up. They lived literally next door to us most of my life as a child. So we began to talk about the idea of moving back to Indianapolis if we could find if I could find the right position. And so I got a subscription to the Sunday Indianapolis Star sent to me in Philadelphia. And the first issue I received contained a notice of a job listing by the Greenleaf Center. They were looking for a new CEO
Wow.
for the center, which was then in Boston and was relocating to Indianapolis.
Oh, wow.
And so I had been familiar with Robert Greenleaf, with the term servant leadership. It had helped to inspire my own work, in the intervening decade. And so what they were looking for was the kind of experiences and skills I had. And so I applied for the position and was hired in the beginning of 1990.
Wow. Wow. I never knew all that background for you. That's fantastic. And I didn't know it started in Boston either. That's interesting. So you mentioned, Larry, that you've been doing this for 25 years now. It's really a quarter of a century that you've been working in servant leadership. So over that time, you must have heard a lot of different definitions of servant leadership come and go. What's been your favorite? How would you define servant leadership?
So I use Robert Greenleaf's definition, the idea that it is the servant leader is servant first. And so there are people who have used the phrase leader as servant. I've seen that in different places, but that does not get to the heart of what Robert Greenleaf was talking about when he looked at people who had a servant's heart and then felt called upon to provide leadership with and for others. I also think that his best test of servant leadership is critical. And to paraphrase, are people healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to become servants? And what's the effect on the least privileged in society? Will they benefit or at least not be further deprived? For me, the idea of the servant first and the best test are at the core of understanding servant leadership, as I understand it and as Robert Greenleaf wrote about it.
I like it. And it does seem like the most pure. You're right. Everybody seems to have different variations or takes on that, but I think that it seems to be the core and the center of where it's all coming from. Now, I know you've also had the opportunity to work with a lot of CEOs and a lot of executives in different organizations that work with servant leadership and try and drive servant leadership in their organizations. Over the years, have you come across something that is particularly challenging about servant leadership? What do you think is what do you believe executives find to be the most difficult part of practicing servant leadership?
Well, I'd like to take a step back if I can.
Absolutely.
And to say this, I think it's easy for us to focus on the idea of executives as servant leaders, and that really is it doesn't get to the point of the fact that servant leaders are found everywhere inside organizations and in society.
Yeah.
And I think if we put too much of a focus on the role of positional leaders or executives, it can shift our understanding of servant leadership in ways that I think is not healthy for us to go.
Yep.
So having said that, let me just try to address your question. When I've worked with people, executives or others, I think one of the key challenges is an understanding of the underlying definition and philosophy or belief that Robert Greenleaf wrote about as part of servant leadership. I think it's sometimes tempting for folks who are genuinely excited about servant leadership to want to kind of jump into implementation without having done the personal work that is necessary. Servant leadership begins with the individual, and then once you have kind of a critical mass of individuals within an organization, it is also then possible for organizations to act as servant-led institutions. But you can't get to that point, I think, realistically, without having invested some time in your own personal growth and development. So I've thought that, for 25 years, that starting with Greenleaf, and particularly the Servant as Leader essay, is always the best place to start. And if you just invest some time in that, reading that, that's a big head start in getting on your way to implement servant leadership within organizations. There have been organizations that have done brown bag lunches, discussions around the servant as leader or other writings by Greenleaf and others. I think those sorts of informal ways of understanding servant leadership can help a lot within organizations. And then after you reach a certain level commitment and understanding. There are consultants and trainers who have been working with servant leadership for many years. There are many of them, but I think the work that Dwayne Trammell and Amy Cooper and their associates have been doing with companies like Southwest Airlines and TD Industries, sort of just stellar examples of what can be done within organizations once they make a commitment to servant leadership.
I love it. I just want to go back and highlight one thing, because you touched on a little bit about you said the servant as leader is kind of the first step you recommend, right? Is one of the things you just invest a little time in reading that, and that was The Servant as Leader by Robert Greenleaf, right? It's it was his original essay, wasn't it? Or
right.
One of, at least, one of the earlier ones. Great. Thank you.
And that essay was published in 1970. So Greenleaf coined the term servant leader
right.
In that essay in 1970, and then went on to write 13 or 14 essays and a couple of books during his lifetime on the idea. If I can, I might just add, it's a little thing, but the hyphen in servant leader is critical. And most people don't look at that, I don't think, or even have even thought about that. But for me, and I think for Greenleaf, the inclusion of the hyphen in the term servant leader was critical in communicating that it's a dual, at least it's a dual commitment to serving and leading, and in fact with servant as the first word, that's the starting point, and then you look for opportunities to lead. So that sometimes gets overlooked, and I just thought I'd mention that.
It's absolutely true. I remember you mentioned it to me a while ago, Larry, and I realized that my blog, I'm modernservantleader.com, I haven't done a good job of keeping that hyphen in there, so I'm going to go back and do some editing, I think, now. But I appreciate it very much. One of the other questions, Larry, that comes up a lot to me, and I've heard several times, is, some people believe one way or the other that servant leadership is either absolutely a religious concept or absolutely not a religious concept. What's your take on it? Is servant leadership religious in nature?
I would say servant leadership, as defined by Robert Greenleaf, is neither religious nor secular, but it's congruent with both. And so I don't see it as either a religious concept or a secular concept, but it has applications in many different places and in different ways within faith traditions, including, I believe, all faith traditions. You can find examples of servant leaders historically and today.
Absolutely.
And then there are many businesses and universities and other institutions that take a focus on a more secular approach to it. I find the idea of the word spirit, which is a word that Robert Greenleaf used frequently as well, is a helpful linking term, because I think whether you're approaching servant leadership from a religious or faith-based approach, or from a secular application within a business or the kind of institution, everyone understands what spirit is, and particularly what the absence of spirit can mean when you don't find it in an organization. And so I think servant-led institutions, people often describe them as spirited. You can find a feeling of spirit with them.
Yeah, I think always of the Southwest, and it's interesting. Probably a little different take on the spirit, but I always think of Herb Kelleher and his nature and the high energy that they have, and the excitement and energy around that. That to me jumps out as the spirited. But I know that was probably a little bit more of an extreme spirited.
But it's a good example too.
Yeah, thanks. And speaking of Southwest Airlines happens to be one of the most well known as one of the industry in which they work. The airline industry is always touted as one of the most difficult industries to make money in, and one of the most challenging. Is there an industry or a functional area like that for servant leadership where it's particularly difficult to practice servant leadership, or where servant leadership just won't work? Have you ever come across an area like that?
It's my belief, and it's also been my own experience, that there is no place that servant leadership cannot operate. So let me take a couple of slices at this. First, I think it's important to realize that anybody can choose to practice servant leadership wherever they are. It does not require the approval of your you're a manager or CEO. Servant leadership is within us, and it's about who we want to be, how we want to try to relate to other people, and we don't need anyone's approval to act as servant leaders within organizations. So, I think it's important to recognize that we can start practicing servant leadership within ourselves and within organizations where we work. As I said earlier, when you get to the point that institutions begin to embrace servant leadership and what it means for the institution, that's great. And I haven't found any particular areas where it's not possible to practice servant leadership. One of the arenas where I've seen the least voicing of servant leadership in some ways has been actually in the political government sphere, where there just aren't. I've not found a lot of people in the elected office, for instance, who have talked about servant leadership. It's been over the years. The energy around servant leadership has sort of focused around businesses, healthcare, higher education, schools, and faith-based institutions. But if there's an area where I'd like to begin to see more people talking about servant leadership, it would be in that realm.
And practicing it more.
Exactly.
Not to get on our political
That's right.
discussions, but I would agree with you 100% there. And on the flip side of that, so not just the areas that are difficult, but do you see trends in our culture today? Do you whether it's the generations of upcoming youth who are entering the workplace, or the internet, or the natural globalization of organizations? Do you see any trends that are making servant leadership easier to adopt or more popular lately? Anything?
Yes. A couple of different thoughts come to mind. One is has been the growth of servant leadership internationally. It started out as Bob Greenleaf from the U.S. And the focus of the Greenleaf Center for 20 or more years was really focused on the U.S. When I came to the Greenleaf Center in 1990, I had a particular interest in a couple of different areas. One was around the possibilities of international development around servant leadership. Another was the idea of servant leadership as related to education, and particularly higher education, but community education and other kinds as well. And so in both of those areas, I've seen tremendous growth and development. In the last 25 years, there has been an explosion, really, of awareness and practices of servant leadership around the world. In the early 1990s, we began to authorize through the Greenleaf Center the translation of the servant leader essay into other languages, and ultimately there were 10 or 12 different language editions of the servant leader essay that was published. And then I had contact with book publishers in other countries and authorized the translation into other languages: Korean, Mandarin, Chinese, lots of other kinds of languages. And then in 2005, my colleague at Gonzaga University, Shan Furch, and I launched the International Journal of Servant Leadership, which is now in its 10th year.
Wow. And
a part of the founding of that annual journal was to try to really encourage awareness and to give a place where other voices of servant leadership outside North America could be published, and that has happened. So we've had 10 issues since 2005, and I think that's helped as well. In the arena of education, there have been really a growing number of institutions that are working with servant leadership in a wide array of approaches, courses that are being taught on servant leadership, courses on leadership or other subjects that include servant leadership texts as part of that. The whole service learning movement was founded in part on a group of experiential educators who came together in 1980 and were looking at Greenleaf's ideas of servant leadership and experiential learning, and brought that together in the new hyphenated term of service learning.
I'm not familiar with that. What is service learning?
Well, service learning is, many schools, universities, and high schools have service projects. Service learning, though, generally includes a learning component. So,
Okay.
Before and after, for instance, a service workshop weekend or longer. There are many longer programs as well. Learning about serving and leading and similar ideas is part of what is intended through service learning programs. So in both international development and in education, I've seen a real growth around servant leadership, which I find greatly encouraging.
Got it. Wonderful. I wasn't familiar with that. That's a great example. Kind of switching gears a little, another area that I get a lot of questions about, a lot of people feel that they are really passionate about servant leadership, but they feel like they are trapped in an organization that is not valuing servant leadership. What do you say to somebody like that when they're in an organization and they really want to practice servant leadership, or they want a servant leadership based organization, but they just feel like the company or organization they work for does not value it?
Well, I say what Robert Greenleaf said in his writings, which is that servant leaders, and I've always been a little uneasy with the term servant leaders. I use the term servant leaders in training in the work I do with Gonzaga University because we're all servant leaders in training, whether we've been working with this concept for 25 or 50 years, or we've just been introduced to it that day.
Yes.
There is always more we can learn. We can always get better. Hopefully, we do get better in our practice of servant leadership as we, sort of move along, get older in life, and have more experiences. So I think that anyone who is interested in servant leadership genuinely can practice it. Of course, you can feel lonely if you feel like you're the only person who's attempting to practice servant leadership within an organization, and so trying to find allies within whatever organization you're in is a good starting point.
Yeah.
If you're in an organization that is a sort of a traditional hierarchical structure, there are always ways you can find people who share some of your interests, and I think just finding one or two allies, and you can begin to sort of learn from one another. Do some shared reading or just a conversation. Life experience, of course, is a major part of servant leadership. You can be, some of the best servant leaders have never heard the term servant leader or read anything about
Absolutely,
it. So you don't have to have read anything about servant leadership to be an effective and faithful servant leader. So the way we simply go about our work within organizations, how we treat one another, is key. So having said that, I do know there are people who are also interested in working for servant-led organizations. And so for me, one of the great things you've done over the years with Modern Servant Leader has been the compilation of these lists of organizations, businesses, other kinds of institutions that have embraced servant leadership in I think, a wide range of ways. But some of them are national and international in scope, have offices in various cities around the country. And so I think one of the great things you've done is to help at least provide some starting point where people who would like to work for a servant-led institution can begin to explore and perhaps attain that possibility for themselves.
Well, thank you, Larry. And I did not pay Larry to put that plug in there for Modern Servant Leader. But thank you. I appreciate it.
It's heartfelt.
Now, many of those individuals who are in an organization where they don't feel servant leadership is valued, usually they're working for a leader or a boss who they don't feel is a servant leader themselves. They typically see somebody who they particularly feel is self-serving. Is it, from your take, is it possible for someone who is self-serving to become a servant leader?
Yes, but I'm also going to take a step back on this one, too. In my experience, it is far too easy for us to judge others and judge
Yes.
positional leaders within organizations as not embracing servant leadership. That may well be true, but there is something within human beings that just kind of brings us to judging others. And
Yes.
over the years, I've come to feel like that's not a good thing for us to be doing. That if, for those of us who aspire to servant leadership, to try to practice and live our lives as servant leaders or servant leaders in training, it's generally good for us to keep the focus on ourselves. Certainly to start with ourselves and to do a careful examination of who we are, how faithfully are we in our own practice of servant leadership. It's just there's a judgmentalism that is not a healthy thing, and I have seen that within servant leadership from time to time over the years. So, having said that, and to try to answer your question as well, I think it is possible for self-serving people to change over time. I think, we see examples in life and literature of people who start out one way and end up another way. Sometimes it takes a major crisis in one's life to sort of see the light, if you will, that the way they've been functioning and operating is not a good way to be in relationship with other people. So, change also doesn't always happen. But one thing Robert Greenleaf was clear on was that people can grow to be servant leaders over time. If even those who are not natural servants, he said, with extensive work and commitment, could grow to be effective servant leaders over time. So part of the work I've done around the years with the characteristics of servant leadership that I identified in his writings have been kind of focused on trying to encourage people to look at ways in which they could become more effective servant leaders and less self-focused.
I want to kind of jump off track a little because what you talked about there, those characteristics, I know that was one of the ways that I came into learning about servant leadership, the characteristics of servant leadership you defined from Robert Greenleaf's writings. And that's helped me grow personally in my career. Like you said, we're all servant leaders in training. I don't claim to be a servant leader myself. I try and work on it.
Me too.
What I wonder is, what do you recommend to somebody who wants to grow their servant leadership skills? How do they best go about that?
Well, Robert Greenleaf wrote about a number of ideas related to servant leadership sprinkled throughout his writings. But in 1991, I began to notice certain keywords and phrases that were appearing over and over in Greenleaf's writings. And so I eventually did a comprehensive read-through of his published work at that time and wrote down a whole list of 40 or 50 different terms, mostly characteristics of servant leaders that he was writing about. And then I went back through and began to make little tick marks every time I saw the word in his published work. And it was through that simple process that I sort of brought together these top 10 characteristics of servant leaders. These were characteristics that Greenleaf identified in his writings, but he just hadn't brought them together in any way. But I did that because I was, from time to time, having people who said to me, they were drawn to servant leadership, but they found reading Robert Greenleaf's writings sometimes hard going. And it can be, and you have to be sort of committed to understanding understanding what Robert Greenleaf's writing about. But I was looking for other ways that people could also enter into servant leadership, and then hopefully, once they got to a certain point, they would feel ready and prepared to sort of read what Greenleaf had written. And so these characteristics came together that way and with that purpose in mind. Over the last 25 years, they have, I think, helped many people to sort of develop an interest around servant leadership and particularly to find ways in which they can sort of grow and develop as servant leaders. These characteristics, the one that was clearly head and shoulders above the others in terms of the frequency in which he mentioned it was listening. And so there's a lot that can be done around trying to become better listeners. I teach one of the two courses I teach at Gonzaga University is focused on listening, grounded in Robert Greenleaf's writings.
Nice.
So I think if we seek to understand and practice listening and persuasion and healing and the other characteristics that Robert Greenleaf wrote about, it helps us to become more effective and faithful servant leaders over time.
Nice. Nice. And for those of you watching, if you're not familiar with the characteristics of servant leadership that Larry's been talking about, we'll make sure and provide a link to those on Spears Center's website for them to all see as well. The other big question we get a lot is, it's not just in servant leadership, but really in all circles around leadership development, leadership training, is the big question of the difference between leadership and management. How do you define the difference between the two?
Well, I have to say I am sort of a one-trick pony. I've always had a single focus on servant leadership and have had little interest, frankly, around general leadership or other approaches to leadership, leadership theories and management. But, in general, I think that leadership is about people and management is about systems and other things. So I think the essence of this is servant leadership is about relationships between people. And so while some people I've seen people talk about servant leadership as a management approach or theory, which I don't like that word at all.
Yeah.
I think it's a philosophy of life. But it really is something that finds its greatest effect in starting with serving others, and then looking for ways to lead.
I like it. One of your many servant leadership advocacy hats that you wear is with Gonzaga University, right? You're, I believe it's the servant leader scholar at Gonzaga. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the work you do at Gonzaga University?
Sure. Sometime in the 1990s, I came into contact with a couple of faculty members at Gonzaga University, and they came to our conference, and one of them, Shan Furch, and the other was Michael Carey. And so I got to know them, invited Shan to publish or to write an essay that I published in the Voices of Servant Leadership essay series that we had during the years I was there. And eventually had both Shan and Mike facilitate the Leadership Institute for Education, one of the programs that we operated in those years as well. And so over time, we would have conversations, and at some point I was asked if I might be able to do something with Gonzaga, and I said I'd be very interested in that possibility. The starting point was the founding of the International Journal of Servant Leadership, an idea which I had tried to get off the ground on two separate occasions in the 1990s, had long protracted conversations with two different universities, and both of them kind of fell flat over time, mostly because of funding questions. And then in 2005, Shan Furch approached me and said, would I be interested in working with him on the journal, serving as senior advisory editor for the journal. And I said, I'd love that. I had embraced that idea for a decade and hadn't been able to make it work because of funding. And he said he had the funding all lined up. So I was just sort of agog with the fact that he already had that taken care of. And so I jumped at the chance. And
nice.
So we started with the journal, and then they invited me to come out and speak with undergraduate and graduate students at Gonzaga. And then about 2008, yes, I was asked to if I would serve as an adjunct faculty member, and then and begin to teach classes. And then shortly after that, the servant leadership scholar position was started. So,
nice.
So I've been teaching. I just finished teaching my 50th class.
Wow.
For Gonzaga. I teach mostly online graduate courses in servant leadership for their master's in organizational leadership program and
Nice.
for the doctoral program in leadership studies. I go out to Spokane once or twice a year and teach intensive classes and give some talks and meet with anybody who's interested in servant leadership. So I've had about 1,000 students over the last 8 years now.
Wow.
And I have discovered, I just turned 60, actually about a week ago,
Wow.
as we're
Happy
taping
belated
this.
birthday.
Well, thank you. And I've discovered that I really enjoy teaching. It's something I'd never had any experience with prior to 2008. But I really feel like, particularly in the online environment, it taps into my writerly instincts and allows me the time to craft responses to questions, to post announcements, that go into some detail about different aspects of servant leadership. And it's been one of the great joys of my life the last 8 years to
Gotcha.
be teaching classes.
Gotcha. Wonderful. Well, I know their students are very fortunate to learn from you. That's fantastic. And you mentioned about your writerly instincts. That there's nobody I know who's gotten more written words out there about servant leadership. I mean, I don't know how many books is it that you've written, edited, published at this point?
Well, I've put together with some by myself, other with colleagues, 15 books over the last 20 years, starting in 1995. 15 books on servant leadership.
Got it. And you have most of them here today. I'd love to. Can we take a walk through? Can you talk us about each of the books and a little bit behind each one?
I'd be happy to do that.
Great.
Yeah.
So, Larry, why don't you just take us through each of the books and tell us a little bit about what each one focuses on?
Okay, I'd be happy to. Part of my personal practice of servant leadership over the years, I think, has really found some of its best expression through the work I've done with writers and contributing authors, co-editors of volumes I've done. And so, in many ways, I have felt, best about my own work as a servant leader in training through the work I've done on books and journals and other publications. Just some brief comments on the books. They sort of fall into three categories. One is a collection of 5 books of Robert Greenleaf's writings, which I put together and then edited and had published. The second category is a group of 6 servant leadership anthologies that I've done over the last 20 years, which have been collections of anywhere from 15 to 30 contributing authors looking at servant leadership from a wide range of perspectives. And part of the work with that has involved wanting to make sure that the idea of servant leadership gets expanded by many people who want to talk about servant leadership in a variety of ways. The work with Greenleaf's 5 books, has been the second part of my work, which has been wanting to make sure that Greenleaf's own ideas on servant leadership, remain available to the reading public. And then the third category has been a collection of some different books that I've done more recently. And journals. So I'll just want to quickly walk us through these publications. The first 2 are 2 books that came about after Robert Greenleaf's death in 1990. His family sent me at the Greenleaf Center 3 or 4 boxes of books and papers that Robert Greenleaf had in his files. And I remember sitting down with opening these boxes, looking through them, and beginning to see the first few pieces of writing which were not familiar to me. These were essentially typed manuscript articles that Robert Greenleaf wrote. And as I went through the first box and then into a second box, was finding more. And then there were a couple of dozen. And then in the end, there were nearly 100 pieces of unpublished writing that I found in Robert Greenleaf's personal papers that his family had sent. Virtually no one was aware that Robert Greenleaf had been writing pieces over a period of 50 years as a means of his own personal understanding of ideas and themes. And he would write anywhere from 2 pages, was sort of the shortest, to there was actually nearly a book length manuscript of about 100 pages that was found in the manuscript writings. And but he wrote about these as a means of just understanding an idea, which is how he learned best, and then filed it away. And so he did not have any intention of publishing most of these. But as I discovered that they were there, I got very excited because here was new ideas and thinking by Robert Greenleaf that had been unearthed. And so I got some money from the Lilly Endowment. We put together a kind of blue ribbon panel, read through the 100 different pieces of writing, and in the end we published 2 books in 1996 on Becoming a Servant Leader, which is a collection of his writings on organizations and leadership practices, which I did with Don Frick, and we had Peter Drucker, who wrote a foreword to that book. And then the second book was Seeker and Servant, Reflections on Religious Leadership, which Anne Fraker and I co-edited. And Parker Palmer wrote a wonderful foreword for that book, and that's a collection of his writing on spirituality and faith-related issues. So 2 new books emerged from this discovery of Greenleaf's hidden writings, if you will, in 1996. In 1998, I put together a series of essays which had been published by the Greenleaf Center, but had never been collected into a book. And it became, in many ways, a sequel to Greenleaf's book, Servant Leadership. This book was called The Power of Servant Leadership and had a foreword written by Peter Vail. So it collected together many of his later essays, many of them written in the late 70s and early 80s. So it's a kind of companion volume to Servant Leadership. In 2002, I put together a collection of what was Greenleaf's book, Servant Leadership, published in 1977, but invited Stephen Covey to write a foreword and Peter Senge to write an afterword. And each of them did a fantastic job in what they had to share about servant leadership and the book, Servant Leadership. And then finally in 2003, I put together a book of Greenleaf's writings which contained Teacher as Servant, which had been out of print since 1979. The original Servant as Leader essay from 1970, which Greenleaf revised by about 50%, and which he initially addressed an audience of higher education, students, faculty, administrators, but changed it. So the original version of that was from 1970, and interestingly, he quoted a recent graduate from 1970 at that time, Hillary Rodham, who is now, of course, Hillary Rodham Clinton. And so she has a paragraph or 2 in this book that Robert Greenleaf wrote, and then a couple of other pieces that round it out. So the Servant Leader Within is about servant leadership as it relates to education, particularly. So those 5 books are the 5 books that are available by Robert Greenleaf today. All of them were published after his death. And so I will sometimes say when I'm giving a talk that you don't have to be alive in order to become a published author or to have new works published. You just need somebody who's interested in your work and willing to put it together. So that's the first batch of books. The second batch of books have been the anthologies of servant leadership. I originally envisioned and have continued to see this played out year after year, that there was a real interest in knowing what other people were having to say about servant leadership on a wide range of topics. And that the best way to do that was by collecting together a series of essays and articles by a wide range of folks. And so in 1995, the first book, Reflections on Leadership, was published. Scott Peck and Peter Senge contributed essays to that, and Max Dupree wrote the foreword to that. 3 years later, 1998, Insights on Leadership followed. Stephen Covey wrote a foreword to that, and it had really some wonderful content. The subtitle of that was Service, Stewardship, Spirit, and Servant Leadership. And I think those 4 words and phrases really appealed to people. It's been the #1 seller of the books that I've put together beyond Greenleaf's book called Servant Leadership. Focus on Leadership was published in 2002. And that book I did with Michelle Lawrence. It has a foreword by Ken Blanchard, And that was followed by Practicing Servant Leadership, a collection of essays, many of which had appeared in the essay series that I edited for the Greenleaf Center during the 1990s and early 2000s. And it's a great source of thought on servant leadership. Up until I guess 2011, then, The Spirit of Servant Leadership, which my colleague at Gonzaga University, Shan Furch, and I put together. And then finally, 2015, last year, as we're taping this, Conversations on Servant Leadership, which is a little different. It's not an anthology per se, but it's a series of interviews that I and others have conducted over the years with folks like Jim Autry and Margaret Wheatley, Parker Palmer, George Zimmer, formerly of the Men's Warehouse, and many others on servant leadership. I forgot to mention Julie Beggs and Hampton Beasley worked with me on putting together the Servant Leader Within, Greenleaf's last book that we published. The third category of books I've worked on has been a series of 4 books in recent years. The first one was in 2008 called Scanlon Epic Leadership. EPIC stands for Equity, Participation, Identity, and Competence. Warren Bennis wrote a foreword to this book, and Max Dupree wrote a wonderful afterword for it. Scanlon relates to Joe Scanlon, who coined that work and the Scanlon Plan, as it ultimately came to be called, which many companies were practicing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and later. And Herman Miller Company was one of the key proponents of both the Scanlon work and servant leadership. In 2009, my friend Paul Davis, also with whom I co-edited the Scanlon Epic Leadership book, approached me and told me that he had snatched away at the last minute from the dumpster the papers of a man named John Donnelly, which were about to be thrown out. They were out on the dock and waiting for the trash to pick them up. Somebody who worked in the company and who had found out about this was horrified and thought that Paul was the person to call because she thought he would appreciate and maybe be able to do something. And he did. He got in his truck and he raced over to the company and rescued off of the dock John Donnelly's papers. Donnelly had been the CEO of Magna Donnelly Company in Michigan. He had an early death in 1985, I think, and so they were finally just sort of throwing out his personal papers after 20 years of his having not been with the company. Paul thought there might be something in these papers and asked me if I would work with him in sort of examining these archival papers initially. And so we went through these boxes in many ways, similar to the process that I had done with Robert Greenleaf's papers years earlier. And sure enough, we discovered a whole lot of writings that Joe Donnelly had done on the theme of the human treatment of human beings. And so it's a great collection. He's not well known at all, but anybody interested in learning more about this business executive's thinking around issues involving community and servant leadership and similar ideas, would do well to explore that book. My colleague George Sanfason and I had a dear mentor, Bill Bodum, who was the CEO of the Townsend and Bodum family of companies for many years. Bill was really the principal person who brought George and I together and has created both a friendship and colleagueship around a number of publications in the last 10 years or so. But Bill, who died in 2005 on Valentine's Day, had published 3 pieces of writing that a number of us knew about during his lifetime, but none of us were really aware of anything else he had done. And unlike any other publication I've ever done, in this particular instance, I had a series of dreams that I was in Bill's basement and was looking for something. That was the first dream. And then a few days later, I had a similar dream that I was in Bill's basement and I was supposed to be finding something. Now, I've never had that experience before or since, but in this case, um, I've puzzled over what it meant. I frankly tried to ignore it, and for 6 months I ignored these dreams, but they kept nagging at me, and I would return repeatedly to thinking about it. So one day I called his daughter, who was living in his home after Bill's death, and asked if she knew of any other writings that Bill had done besides the three that we were aware of. And she said, well, no, she wasn't, but that he had tons of file cabinets and boxes down in the basement, which she did not really know what was in there. And so I told her about this dream and asked whether she'd be willing to have me come up and maybe spend a weekend down in the basement going through materials. I talked with my friend George Sanfason, who was a close friend of Bill's and his daughter's, and we agreed that we would go over to his home together and spend the weekend going through the basement. And again, I should have not been as surprised as I was given my previous experience, but we began to unearth all these writings that Bill had done. And there was ultimately, I think, about 1,100 manuscript pages of talks, of essays, of his own reflections, and many other things that he had done. And so we decided, in consultation with his family and friends, that we would try to put together a book of Bill Bodum's writings as a testament to his commitment to servant leadership and other ideas. In particular, Bill had a lifelong commitment to raising awareness and practice of the Beatitudes. And so this book was titled Within Your Reach, The Beatitudes in Business and Everyday Life, and is a collection of writings by Bill Bodum. The last book in this category is Fortuitous Encounters, which grew out of work that and thinking that D.J. Dupree of Herman Miller Company had around the notion of fortuitous encounters. My friend Paul Davis and I decided to collaborate on gathering together a series of brief stories, true stories by people in which they shared their experience around fortuitous encounters in their own lives. And very pleased with the stories that are in here. It's a broad range of pieces. Many of them have servant leadership woven within them as well. And so this is an interesting volume called Fortuitous Encounters, Wisdom Stories for Learning and Growth. A fourth category of publications has been the International Journal of Servant Leadership, which we started in 2005. Shan Furch is the editor of the journal. I serve as a senior advisory editor. And together we have created 10 volumes over the last 10 years of the journal. Part of our thinking in starting it was to encourage international understanding and practices of servant leadership, to bring in voices that were not being heard from outside North America around servant leadership. And it's a refereed journal, so there's a blind panel that reads through publications and then makes selections for most of them. And has been really a means of spreading servant leadership ideas and themes throughout higher education in particular. While it's not here, I would just also mention that in recent years I have found great joy in collaborating with a series of co-writers on pieces. For many years I just did writing on my own, but about 8 years ago, I began to work with folks like George Sanfason, Richard Leider, Paul Davis, Ralph Lewis, and others on pieces of writing related to servant leadership and looking at it from very different perspectives. So anybody who's interested can go to the Spear Center website, www.spearcenter.org, and can find some of these essays that include among them essays I've written on the understanding and practice of servant leadership characteristics, a series of 3 or 4 pieces with Richard Leider that I've done looking at seekers and servant leadership, philanthropy and servant leadership. Ralph Lewis and in fact my wife Beth Lafferty and I collaborated on a piece on Myers-Briggs and servant leadership. So anybody interested in Myers-Briggs and servant leadership might be interested in looking at that. And very recently, a colleague of mine at Gonzaga, Joe Albert, and I collaborated on a piece on Bruce Springsteen as a servant leader, looking at his music and lyrics, as well as the way in which he has collaborated with his bandmates over 40 years now. And anybody who's a fan of Bruce Springsteen, as I am, might find that piece to be of particular interest. So the books, the journals, and the essays that I've written around servant leadership have really been a major focus of my work, and has brought great joy to me personally, and also I hope has helped to spread the good news of servant leadership. So thank you.
Well, thank you for walking us through that, Larry. Now, in addition to the books, I know that you've also gotten some other press, and like when you were at Greenleaf Center a while ago, there was that really big piece by NBC Dateline. How did that impact servant leadership? I mean, that was probably at the time, it was got to be the biggest audience that you've had at that point, or we've had in the servant leadership circle.
Well, I think certainly within the expanding the servant leadership movement, it was a pretty big deal. There's not a lot that can be done or learned even in a 7-minute segment.
Right.
But I was contacted by the producers, asked to come out to New York. They did an interview with me, and then I provided them with contacts, a number of folks, John Bogle of Vanguard Mutual Funds, who they interviewed, and one or two other folks. So it was within a 72-hour period. It was a very intensive 3-day experience with the producers and the interviewer. The program aired and was seen by 10 million people, and so it was a big thing insofar as 10 million people were introduced to the concept of servant leadership in a 7-minute video segment. Interestingly, the Greenleaf Center was a relatively small nonprofit organization, but for an organization of our size, it had a big impact. We were inundated for really a couple months after that with lots of inquiries of people who wanted to order books or to find out more about the center. We gained a number of new members as a result of that. And just in general, it was a very positive effect for the Greenleaf Center. We had more people at our conferences and the several years that followed that.
Nice.
And I admired the fact that they had enough interest to want to do a segment on servant leadership. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And again, for those watching, I'll put a link below the video to the footage from NBC Dateline, so you can see it there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Larry. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you today that you'd like to talk to the subscribers and readers of Modern Servant Leader about?
Well, I would simply like to say that one of the growing edges for me around servant leadership and my own exploration, particularly in recent years, has been my work with George Sanfilippo, my colleague. We've collaborated on several things, and George has had a decades-long commitment to the idea of the Council of Equals. And I know you'll be interviewing George for another segment in your series. But through my friendship with George, I've come to understand more clearly than I did in the first 20 years what Robert Greenleaf meant when he focused upon the Council of Equals as a pivotal way in which organizations can practice servant leadership. And so I guess if I had a closing statement, it would be just to invite viewers to read what Robert Greenleaf had to say about the Council of Equals, particularly in the Institution of Servant essay, to read George Sanfilippo's book on the Council of Equals, and to, if you've developed sufficiently around servant leadership within an organization, to look carefully at the Council of Equals model as one which might speak to you.
I like it. Thank you. And yes, if the video is not out there soon, there will be an interview with George Sanfilippo as well on the Council of Equals. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Larry, if there's anybody who wants to follow up with you or learn more about your work and the Spear Center's work, how do they find you?
Well, I'm on the internet at www.spearcenter.org. So there's a website there with lots of free articles and essays that you can download, and other information on servant leadership as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Larry. It's really an honor and a pleasure. We appreciate you taking the time for Modern Servant Leader.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you for the work that you do. I really appreciate it too.
Thank you. Till next time, keep serving.